Our last unit is going to be going over disease and evolution, or maybe more appropriately, how evolution and our understanding of evolution can help us to treat, diagnose, and perhaps even come up with new therapies for ameliorating, getting rid of diseases. And we're going to look at diseases in a very broad definition. We typically think of infectious diseases, at least I do. That's the first thing that comes to my mind when you say disease. But realize that the word disease is fairly general, and really, if we apply it broadly, can be applied to any physiological process that is detrimental to the health of an organism. So this can include infectious diseases, but can also include lifestyle diseases such as diabetes. We'll look at that here in just a little bit. Potentially even could include things like addictions that have a long-term detrimental impact on your health, and maybe even psychological issues that maybe don't have a obvious or immediate physiological and physical diagnoses. Okay, so it's helpful for us to understand how we think about disease, and we can break disease down into 4 separate categories, all of which are important for our understanding and eventual treatment and intervention if we want to be able to lessen the impact of disease on humans. Now, this could apply to other organisms also, so if you're a veterinarian, I don't mean to be a speciesist, right? Somebody who favors one species over another, but we're going to focus on human health for this class. So the 4 areas are listed here. A proximate reason is the immediate cause, and we're going to look at 2 examples: an infectious disease, the COVID-19 virus, and then we'll also look at diabetes here in a little bit. The second stage that we can evaluate and look at is a developmental. So this can include epidemiology, or the pathology of a disease, how it begins, what the middle symptoms are, what happens if you're cured of it, or if it becomes more and more serious. Those are all developmental concerns and are important for understanding the treatment of and intervention for a disease. Now, evolutionarily, diseases are very important. We're going to spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about evolution. And so this is the impact of natural selection on either hosts or on the individuals that are being impacted by the disease you're looking at. Or we could look at the evolution and changes that are occurring within a parasite and how that would impact its host. And then finally, phylogenetic. Phylogenetic, of course, anytime you make a phylogeny, either of disease-causing agents such as bacteria or viruses, or perhaps the individuals that you're looking at their relationships in phylogeny to see if that plays a role in development of the disease. Now, there's overlap in many of these. In evolution and phylogenetics, certainly there are areas of overlap where you'd be looking at both evolutionary issues and phylogenetic issues. So it's not a complete, separate 4 different categories. But at some level, all diseases are approached and studied using these 4 general areas. So be familiar with them. And let's look at 2 examples. The first one we're going to look at, seems appropriate, is the novel coronavirus, or COVID-19. So initially, we want to look at the proximate cause. I had that in the wrong order, so let's fix that. Of course, the proximate cause, as for any infectious disease, is a pathogen. In this case, it's a virus. This is a computer-generated diagram of what the coronavirus looks like. It is protein capsule. And so we can look at it, we can study it, but the proximate cause of any infectious disease is, of course, the infectious agent. That's pretty easy. A virus, a bacteria, a protozoa, a fungus, sometimes other things, but those 4 are the big ones. And so that's easy for coronavirus. You have this growing in your body. That's the proximate cause. Okay? And then developmentally, we would look at how it progresses. So we might look in the developmental phase as transmission. How is this transmitted? Is it airborne? Is it through contact? For some diseases, it's incredibly easy to transmit the measles for instance, it's very, very easy to transmit measles by touch, or even being in the same room a couple hours after somebody with an active case of the disease. With coronavirus, it's new enough that we're still trying to understand all of the transmission issues and trying to understand risks and how we can alleviate them. And so in the early phases of the pandemic, people have kind of swung back and forth with not worrying about it or going to extremes, wearing masks. Whether or not that helps and how much it helps, we still aren't certain, but there's work being done on it and data being collected. Now, in addition to transmission, we might also look at the process of the disease once it infects the organism, and that's part of development also. So what are the initial stages of infection? How does the disease progress? Are there certain complications that are common and rise frequently in individuals that have this disease? And so all of those we'd be looking at, and maybe even then we might look at resistance. Now, as we start talking about resistance of individuals in the population, we're really starting to look more at an evolutionary explanation, but there is going to be some overlap. Now, in addition to looking at resistance for an evolutionary explanation, we also would maybe be looking at how the virus changes and whether or not that has an impact on its virulence or on its treatability or any other number of other factors that might be critical and important for people studying this. Now, this is obviously a phylogeny, but it's looking at a phylogeny going back only to December of 2019, the earliest cases. And so they have samples and they have looked at all of the changes and made a phylogeny of using the entire genomes of these novel coronaviruses. Now, this is some phylogenetic input here also, but this is important. Now, most of these changes are going to be neutral. We talked about that. Most mutations that occur in organisms are effectively neutral. They're not good, they're not bad. But even if they're neutral and they don't have an impact on the phenotype, the physical characteristics of the virus, they can still be used to trace its history. So we don't have to have a mutation with a phenotypic impact to have it be useful. And of course, we can look at not only the phylogeny of the recent outbreak, so these are all human cases going back from January up until, this is very recent, up until the middle of March. Okay, and so we can look at this and evaluate this and look for clusters and changes, and if one group is seeing higher death rates than others or are seeing different characteristics in one area than another, we maybe can correlate that with certain specific changes. So that's very, very helpful as we're studying the evolution of these sorts of virulent things. And we could even extend that more classic phylogeny. We're looking at phylogeny of viruses across a much wider range. So we have the novel coronavirus here in red. Notice that at this level there's very little differences. There's still mutations and changes, but they're all going to be very, very similar to one another when we're looking at this larger scale. And you may have heard of this, but the closest relatives of this novel coronavirus is a virus found in bats. And so it's thought that this was a transmission from bats to humans. And in the next unit, 4.6b, we'll be looking, 4.5b, we'll be looking at how transmission from a different species might impact the evolution of the gene. But understanding that history and looking at the phylogeny is critical. So let's take a minute and now let's do one more example looking at these four levels, and we're going to use a lifestyle disease or a non-infectious disease, diabetes. And we're going to focus on type 2 diabetes. There are actually several types of diabetes, but two common ones that most people know about. Type 2 diabetes is adult onset diabetes, that's what it's called sometimes. It's largely a disease of diet, exercise, lifestyle choices, but there are some genetic contributing factors also. So the proximate cause in this case is not an infectious agent. There's no bacteria or virus or fungus that causes diabetes. Now there are obviously some complications and comorbidities that could occur with infectious diseases, but those are secondary and not part of the diabetes disease as we define it. So the proximate cause for diabetes is just an imbalance, an inability to regulate blood sugar levels. Okay, that's a nice, easy proximate cause. And that inability to regulate blood sugar is actually different in different types of diabetes. In type 2 diabetes, the receptors on the cells that are binding insulin and then helping to regulate blood glucose levels begin to become damaged. And so your body is unable to regulate that. Your body still makes insulin, but the receptors are no longer as sensitive and don't receive it. And that's actually very different than type 1 diabetes, right? So the proximate cause of type 1 diabetes is still the same. It's an inability to regulate blood level. But as we begin to study it more closely, the reasons, and get into this developmental portion, typo there, let me fix that. In this developmental portion, we can begin to look more at the causes. And for type 1, it's an inability to produce insulin. So this also has some important implications for treatments, right? So if you have type 1 diabetes, it's sometimes also called insulin-dependent diabetes because your body doesn't make insulin, so you can get an artificial insulin source, and as long as you're careful about it, it's still a very large undertaking, and you have to monitor your blood levels and have insulin handy all the time. But if you do that, you can live a healthy life by artificially supplementing insulin as needed. But if you have type 2 diabetes, you can only do that in the early stages. So if the receptors are just not working very well, you up your insulin levels, and that can help a little bit. But if the damage continues, if you continue to damage more and more receptors, then suddenly that elevated insulin level is no longer there. So it's kind of like, you know, if you're deaf, you can turn up the volume of the music you're listening to, and that works up to a certain point. But once you get more and more deaf, it just, you know, you just can't do it. Now, in addition to the development of and the mechanism for diabetes, we could also look at its impact on the body. And with diabetes, this is massive. Diabetes impacts just about every major system, and some more severely than others. And so we could look at that, and then we could also look at whether their genetic background has a contributing factor. Now we're starting to get into the evolution of organisms and why they are susceptible to this. And along those lines, you can look at the evolution and history among different groups of individuals. And there's some evidence now that diabetes was actually selected in our ancestors over tens of thousands of years, maybe even more, that there was actually selection for alleles that predispose people to diabetes. And remember, we talked about how many genetic traits have trade-offs, that you have something beneficial that comes out of it, but maybe there's a slight detriment. And overall, if it's more beneficial than detrimental, it will be kept and eventually become very common in the population. And it looks like many of the alleles that contribute to the genetic side of diabetes were actually selected for in our ancestors, because the trade-off then was much more on the positive side. Now today, with our modern environment, freely available fat and sugar and other lifestyle issues, that trade-off has swung the other way. But it's been such a recent change in our lifestyles that there has not been strong selection on that. And not only that, but our modern technology and ability to intervene with this disease has played a role, and is also having an impact on selection. One of the interesting things is that there are certain genetic groups that are predisposed to diabetes. One of these, as I've got pictured up here in the upper left, is a group of Native Americans that originally ranged in northwestern Mexico and the southwestern United States. And they have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And the reason for this is that selection for that ethnicity, within that ethnicity, selection was much, much stronger than in many areas, because they lived and had a diet with very, very little fat and carbohydrates. They ate lots of meat, lots of vegetables, but not vegetables that were very rich in carbs. And so alleles that allowed them to make full use of that and generate it, but had the downside of causing diabetes, were selected for because they never had the opportunity to eat high fat, eat high sugar, and in the past, diabetes was not really a problem at all. So having those alleles was a great thing. But now, as they have begun to switch over to a Western lifestyle, Western diet, and eat, you know, hamburgers and French fries and all pizza and all the other great things that are part of our Western culture, that has had a much more severe impact on their physiology than on other ethnicities. So understanding that and understanding evolution, evaluating those differences and those genetic changes can help us to alleviate the genetic side. And then finally, you might not think that phylogeny plays much of a role in diabetes, but there still are applications for it. So this is a phylogeny, a history of mitochondrial types, where some of them might be more susceptible and it might play a contributory role. And so if we can identify distinct relationships within those, we can look at where those changes were and how they arose. We could potentially also extend this, and we could look at phylogeny of mammals and see which of those mammals, I don't even know the answer to this, I need to look it up, but which mammals are also susceptible to diabetes. Are there species that have homologous processes, meaning that they evolved from the same basic set of genes? Or maybe there are other species with analogous processes where they are similar, they look somewhat the same, but they didn't arise at the same point, they have arisen independently. And so understanding which organisms are susceptible, and if it's all in one group or if it arose many, many times, we need a phylogeny to do that. So there's still a really important and major role for phylogeny, even in understanding the diseases, disease processes that are lifestyle diseases. Now, many diseases have both genetic and environmental impacts, and so we need to study that at the developmental level, and then for the genetic ones, extend that into the evolutionary and phylogenetic spheres. So just be aware of these two examples. If I ask you for an infectious disease, proximate cause is easy. If it's a lifestyle disease, you maybe need to be a little bit more familiar with the disease. So probably on an exam, I'll stick to diabetes since we talked about it in some detail if I use a lifestyle disease.